What's up guys, welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. In this video, I'm going to be going through the basics of assessing a card's condition. This is a topic I've had a few people ask about in previous videos, and that's why I decided I'd make a video about it myself. And just before I get into things, I thought I'd say, if any of you have any other topics you'd like to see me make a video on, just put them down in the comments below and I'll always be happy to at least think about it. Being able to assess the condition of your cards accurately is useful for a lot of different things. So first off, if you're ever looking to sell any cards, it's very useful to be able to describe the conditions of your cards accurately in order to avoid disputes with your buyers. Next off, if you want to grade any of your cards professionally, it's good to be able to tell which ones are going to be able to get a higher grade and which ones are not worth sending. And finally, even if you're just looking to buy cards for your binder, it's still good to have some idea of how to grade these things to make sure you don't get a bad deal when you buy a card as near mint and it actually comes in worse condition than that. Now, before I go into more detail about the conditions of the cards themselves, I thought I should just say as a preliminary remark that different card games and even different sets within the same card game often require different skills, and you have to look out for different things when you're assessing their conditions. So for example, just because you're familiar with assessing the condition on a card like this Invader of Darkness, that doesn't mean that you'd necessarily be able to transfer those skills to grading Pokemon cards or sports cards or anything like that. Each card game and each sort of era of each card game has its own issues that you have to be aware of. And that's just something you build up over time with experience. So anyway, moving on to actual condition grading. The first mistake that a lot of people make when they're not too experienced with assessing conditions is to confuse good looks with good condition. So here's an Invader of Darkness from Invasion of Chaos. And when you look at the card like this, it's inside a sleeve, and you're just looking at the front. You'd think that this is a pretty decent conditioned card. You can't see much edge wear. There aren't any obvious creases or bends running across the card. It looks nice. And of course it's true that this makes a pretty good binder card. But as soon as you take it out of the sleeve and you start looking in more detail under the light, things will very quickly go south with a card like this. So you can easily see, for example, that this corner on the bottom is not at all how it should be. There are a couple of pretty big nicks on the top edge, and the whole of the top edge is a little bit kind of soft. So that's the kind of thing where you only see it once you actually take the card out of the sleeve and you put it in good lighting. Now the other thing is obviously that you always have to look at the back of a card when assessing conditions. So if we flip this thing over, you can see it gets even worse because this thing has a crease all the way across the back. It's got, again, stuff going on the top edge. It's got scratching. And in general, this card would pretty much be considered heavy play by anyone with any experience grading cards. So I'm sure most of you watching would already be familiar with what I've said there. But I thought I should just go through it in case anyone has never assessed conditions before, just to say that because a card looks good doesn't mean that it's in good condition. And kind of leading on from that point, I have to say that whenever you're assessing the condition of a card, you always have to take the card all the way out of the sleeve it's in. Now obviously, especially with more expensive cards like this Magic Formula, I can understand why you would be reluctant to take a card out of its sleeve, because you don't want to damage it. But this card is a good example of why you always have to do that in order to correctly assess the condition. So if I take this guy most of the way out of the sleeve and put it under the light, you can see that it looks pretty nice. On the front, it doesn't really have any scratches or anything like that. And even if we flip it over to the back, okay, there are a few light scratches, but overall the condition looks pretty solid. And it doesn't have much edge wear either. So when you're looking at it like this, you might think that the card is near mint or maybe at worst a solid light play. But if I take the card all the way out of the sleeve, you should be able to see that on this bottom edge, there's some pretty bad chipping on both corners, especially the bottom right corner. And this is a result of the card being sleeved badly. So if you're not careful when dealing with solid sleeves like this one here, when you're putting the card into the sleeve like this, it's very easy to catch one of the bottom corners on the sleeve and actually damage the card as a result. So yeah, that's another reason why you always have to take the card fully out of the sleeve when you're assessing its condition. So I already covered with that Invader of Darkness two of the most serious kinds of damage to look for on a card, which are bends and creases. And the best way to look for those, as with most defects, is by putting the card under good lighting. But another very important thing to look out for on a card is pressure marks. So when I put this magic cylinder from this angle, I mean, it already looks in pretty bad shape. You can see the edge wear, you can see it's got some surface wear. But when I put it under the light, you can also see that it has all sorts of deep markings in the card. And especially in this bottom left area, there are a lot of pressure marks digging right into the back of the card. Now, especially with foil cards, those pressure marks usually do not show through to the front, and you can see it doesn't have anything on here. But just being on the back is enough to seriously knock the condition of a card. So again, like that Invader of Darkness, this would be considered a heavy play card by most people. So I've mentioned bends and dents already in this video as things to look out for when you're assessing the condition of a card. But there are a couple of sort of variants on those which I thought I'd mention because they come up a lot when you're grading Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Now the first one is a binder ding or binder impression. That is the damage caused when you store a card in a 3-ring binder and you don't store it correctly. So the pages overlap with the 3 metal rings and the rings dig into a card and cause a dent. So this Serpentine Dragon actually has 3 of the same defect. I assume it was put into different binders at different times. And the thing to look out for is right along the edge of a card, you'll see these little impressions into the surface. So when you're looking for dents on a card, you should always focus on those areas around the edges. And the other thing is to do with soft corners. So often a card will not have any kind of bend on it, but when you put the corners under the light, you can see a kind of softness appearing. And the light doesn't quite reflect as it should, like with this corner. When you feel a corner like that, it's very soft and flimsy, and it's caused by the different layers of the corner separating, so it no longer has that same integrity. So it's another defect to look out for, and it's something you have to look a little harder to spot, because unlike a crease or a big bend, it doesn't really jump out at you when you just look at the card head on. At this point in the video, I've been through all of the most common and most universal defects that you'll come across when trying to assess the condition of a Yu-Gi-Oh card. And in order of most severe to least severe, those would be creases, bends, pressure marks, soft corners, and finally scratching and edge wear. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what constitutes near mint, light play, moderate play, or heavy play exactly in this video, because those standards do vary depending on what website you're dealing with, what country you're in, and other things like that. But certainly, a card should not be considered near mint unless the only defects it shows are some light degree of edge wear and scratching. Any kind of pressure mark, bend, or crease, or anything like that should immediately take a card at least down to light play, if not worse. And another thing to mention, just before I move on to more detailed stuff about the grading of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, is that any kind of water damage or staining on a card immediately removes it from being given pretty much any condition grade, no matter how good the rest of the card is. And any card like that should just be considered damaged. Now, the last few things I'm going to go through in this video are certain factory defects, which affect different eras of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. The first of the issues I'm going to talk about is waxing. So this is something that affects a lot of different old school sets, and probably most of all, it affects the sets between Invasion of Chaos and Flaming Eternity. And what this issue is it doesn't affect the front of cards at all, but very often on the backs of cards from these sets, you'll find this strange kind of gunk on the back surface, these little scuffs, and a vertical strip down the middle as well. So this is a result of wax being applied to the back of the card in the factory, not being removed. And then when the card slides around on all the different machines and sorting processes it goes through in the factory, it picks out little scratches because the wax is very sensitive. So this is something, it's somewhat subjective whether you say this affects the condition of the card or not. Some people still call cards near mint even when they look like this, and other people are reluctant to. But it's definitely important to be aware when you're looking at cards from this era that this defect is a factory issue, and this is not actual wear that you're seeing on the back of the card. The next thing to mention, which even more so than the point about waxing, is something which most people would not say affects the condition of a card, is to do with ultimate rares. So this is a Wing Karibo level 10, which I picked up recently. This card is actually freshly pulled from the pack a couple of weeks ago. But if I flip it over to the back, you can see it's got some strange markings all across the back. And if you didn't have much experience grading these cards, you might be tempted to say that it was damaged because it's got little pressure marks, apparently, in the back. But what this is the stamping of the ultimate rare going through to the back of the card. And it's especially common on European print ultimate rares because they had a deeper stamp than the North American versions. Now this is something which definitely does not affect the condition of a card. So even though this card has all of this stuff visible on the back, it's still definitely considered near mint. And as a seller, I think it's fair enough to say that you should mention it when you're selling a card. But you should not let it knock you below calling a card near mint just because it's got these impressions on the back from the ultimate rare stamping. And the last factory issue I'm just going to quickly mention is fading. So people often get confused when they see cards like this trap hole because they're not sure if it's got some kind of factory defect going on or if it's sustained damage from being left out in the sun or something like that. Now I'm going to make a future video on this topic in a lot more detail, but for now I just thought I'd say that fading, like you see on this trap hole, is a factory defect and it's not something that affects the condition. So you can see this trap hole is in great shape front and back, definitely near mint condition. And the fact that the color is not normal on the front does not detract from that. And I'm just going to quickly contrast that with an example of actual sun damage on a card. So an easy way to spot sun damage is the fact that it will not affect the entire card. You can see this Shining Fair Wingman, for the most part, looks normal. But if we look at this top right area, the top right corner, there's a little line, and above that line, the card looks very washed out and bluish. So that's your classic color to look for on a sun-faded card. And a card that is sun-faded should definitely be considered damaged. So even though this card is in decent shape, you could not consider it near mint because of that damage. Okay, and that pretty much does it for this video. Just before I end the video, one thing I thought I'd say in my sort of concluding remarks is that, especially when you're starting out as a seller, it's always better to err on the side of caution when grading a card. So if you're not sure, for example, whether to call a card light play or near mint, it's always better to call it light play, because that way you know your buyer won't be disappointed. And over time, if you build up a reputation for being someone who grades their cards harshly, you're also much more likely to be able to ask a premium for a card when it's in near mint to mint condition, because your buyers will believe you that the card really is that clean. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot. And of course, stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to go into much more detail about the higher end of card condition grading and how to tell if your card is worth sending to Beckett or PSA to be professionally graded. So thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.